Reagan, just doing a sound test with you. Can you hear me? Reagan, if you could just type in under question and answer, just let me know. Okay, great. Thanks, Ahmed. Thank you, Borg. Thank you, Winnie. That's appreciated. Thank you, Reagan. I'm going to start in about 2 minutes, so I'll give a minute past 8, past the hour, and then I'll go ahead and begin. So just be patient. Hello, everyone. This is Mark Lascola. I'll be your presenter today during the next hour. I want to welcome you to the webinar, The 4 Big Reasons Organization Design Projects Fail. Before I do that, I want to just go over a couple mechanics with you. The first is that you're not going to be able to voice your questions. So there's a Q&A on the Zoom command. And if you can type in your questions there, I'll go ahead and monitor those as we go. Or you can certainly use the webinar chat as well if you want to do that. But we will monitor that as we go. I suspect there'll be other attendees popping into the webinar, as usually is the case. We had, I think, close to 65 of your colleagues sign up from around the globe. And as you probably all have experienced, from time to time, we get about 50% of those show up. So that's what we're expecting. I will start in just another 30 seconds, officially start the webinar. Just to also let you know that the webinar is being recorded and that the slide deck that I share with you will be made available in a PDF later today after we complete the webinar. So if you're quickly taking notes, just know that that'll be coming your way, as well as a recording of the webinar for those of you who want to revisit it or go back and look at the materials. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and get going. A lot of familiar names joining into the call, and for those of you who I know, it's good to see you online. For those new, welcome. I want to say thank you very much to the organization design community for inviting me to provide this webinar to you. As a way of working together, I will try to answer questions as we go. I'm going to cover 4 reasons why organization design projects fail. And I'm going to share with you for each reason, for each pitfall, and for each wisdom, I'm going to stop and let you ask some questions and try to address those so that we have an opportunity to go into more specifics or more detail. I will also provide you some examples as well in terms of our design work so that you have something to push off of and to make it real. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get going. And if anyone has any problems hearing me, just let me know as we go. So let's see here. So a little bit about me. My first redesign experience was in 1987. It was at that moment that I kind of caught the fever to do this design work. And since then, I started on the mark in 1990. And as a team, we've completed close to 450 redesigns in 40 countries on 5 continents for just about every type of business function, as well as enterprise-wide redesigns. We've trained and developed over 5,000 internal change agents in our organization design solution. And we have a very detailed, comprehensive methodology that is also included in an app for tablets and handheld devices in both iOS and Android. If anyone is interested, it's called On the Marks Organization Design Solution. I'm also honored to be a founding board member and trustee of the European Organization Design Forum, and a colleague with Borg and others on this call as a board member on the organization design community. I also want to recognize, for those of you who knew him, Stuart Wiggum, who is was a board member and trustee for the EODF and Organization Design Institute, as well as a Organization Design Forum in the US, was also a board member, just recently came off the board. Stuart passed away right before the end of the year. And I want to dedicate this webinar to Stuart and his genius and just who he is, and celebrate the man and his contribution to our field. So for those of you who know Stuart, I just wanted to put that out there and let you guys be aware of it. All right, so that's it about me. Let's keep going. I want to take on, before I go into the details of the pitfalls, the 4 of them, I want to share with you that our work is very pragmatic and very practical. And while there's lots of theory out there, I would say we have, the pitfalls that I'm about to share with you come from very real work and real examples. It doesn't matter if you're putting in agile or you're putting in ecosystems or you're designing around the customer. It doesn't matter what the content of the organization design solution is, these pitfalls apply. So the first pitfall I want to talk about is mismanagement of stakeholders. And the wisdom here is that everybody reports to somebody. So let me explain to you what I mean by that in a little bit more detail. Is that it's quite common that the proper stakeholder work is not done, and that stakeholder work has to be, so if you're working at the enterprise level, has to be with the board, you have to be sure that the leaders who are sponsoring the effort do not get too far ahead from those that they report to. And we've had a handful of what I would call, I wouldn't call them failures, but I would call them that they were design projects that went sideways. And one of the reasons is essentially because stakeholders were not managed well. And so let me kind of go into a little bit more detail on this. What we recommend that you do is proactively identify and manage stakeholders from start to finish. Identify impacts, do it through evidence, regular report and update on stakeholders. It's not enough to just say, yes, I've updated someone. It's one of the things you have to be really careful about. Early on, you want to keep a close eye on key stakeholders, and sometimes that key stakeholder, we define a key stakeholder as someone who can make your life miserable, who can stop the project. And you want to make sure that you identify that early on, all along the way. And when we're talking about stakeholders, it's not just those who somebody reports to, it's also laterally or horizontally. Where you might redesign a function within a business, and there's work interdependence, and that work interdependence will impact another department, another function, and the leader of that function will say, no, you can't do that. And so you have to make sure that that those stakeholders, both from a vertical perspective and horizontal perspective, are taken into account. This next bullet here about keep a close eye on long-standing work relationships that may be leveraged to further self-interest over collective good. Interesting story. We did a redesign for a large high-tech enterprise, and the engineering function was pulled apart, and engineering work was put on in manufacturing in the front line, and which basically meant then the engineering director direct reports went from about 300 to about 60, and only innovation was left in engineering. That person had a very good relationship from past experience with a board member, went around the executive sponsor and was able to bring the project to a stop for a period of time. And so what I mean by that fourth bullet here is you need to know if people have worked with people and who they've worked with, and you want to watch all those moving parts. And this applies to, as we think about stakeholders, suppliers, vendor partners, customers as well. One of the ways that we do that, just from a common tool, many of you are probably familiar with this, is we do a stakeholder analysis all along the way. And we put together a very detailed plan. This is an example of charting those stakeholders on influence and level of interest. In the digitalized version on the right-hand side, you have the red zone, which is where there's high influence and low level of support. But I won't get into how to do a stakeholder analysis, but I'm happy to answer any questions after the webinar on this. Next example I want to give to you is we do a change impact analysis all along the way to extrapolate consequences on the organization and who might be impacted. So it's quite common in early phases of a design project where your stakeholders are expanding, because as you're doing the change impact analysis to whatever's being designed or being discussed, that it becomes apparent that other parts of the business, there are other stakeholders involved. So this keeps us on the straight and narrow in terms of identifying key stakeholders. So before I go to the next pitfall, I want to see if there are any questions. So let me just be quiet for just a second and see if there's any questions before I move forward. All right, I don't see any questions, so I'll keep going. Pitfall number 2 is focusing on people. The wisdom here from OTM is always focus on the value that's created for customers and the value creation work or value creating work. A more crude wisdom is the work always comes first, not people. And I know the significant, and I'll use this word deliberately, seduction to focus on people because it's the obvious thing, but it's the thing that will keep the organization the most as it is today versus really making the changes that need to be made. So when you focus solely on the work, it frees you from talking about people and really focuses on what is the work that needs to be done and how do we bound that work together as a basis or as a DNA or the beginning of structure. What to do, what not to do. Apply outside-in thinking and designing first, so meaning that you design from what your customers want and what you're trying to deliver for those customers, as well as the customer experience. Always start with the core transformational work that creates real value for customers. There's the wisdom that we talk about a lot about following the work. Now, for us, management roles and jobs and management work is not core work, and it's not value creating. From a lean perspective, management is necessary waste. So the avoidance here is don't start with levels, don't start with management roles, don't start with those elements, which is fairly classic for the large consulting houses. Question, Michael, who do you involve in the change impact analysis? Good question, Michael. Let me take that in just a second, and I'll finish this. Address people and jobs much later in the design phase. So when we never address people other than their being completely involved in the project, which is an important element, but we don't address people and jobs until the detailed design, transition, planning phases. So talking about people and what people do and in what jobs for us is in the first 4 or 5 phases is almost non-existent. And so before I go forward, let me go back. Michael, on the change impact analysis, it depends on how high involvement the project is. So we're doing an enterprise-wide redesign right now that's involving everyone in the organization in the redesign process. And in that case, we're actually touching many people organization-wide in the change impact analysis, as well as the leaders, so that they're completely clear about what the potential impacts are of what they're designing. But there are other projects that are more confidential, and the leaders say, no, we just need to have a small team in the room. And in that case, because of the confidence required, we will keep it limited to just those in the room doing the design work. Let me know, Michael, if that answers your question. Let me move forward. Here's an example for us of what we do early on to set up a set of requirements around the customer experience today versus tomorrow. I think you can read these in more detail, but essentially the activity is for a leadership team to practically define what's the customer experience today and what's the customer experience required tomorrow. And it becomes a set part of the requirements for the future operating model. Another key thing that we do that I wanted to share with you is when we focus on the work, we use this value stream schema to identify the core work. And one of the things I want to highlight is we pair decisions with work and not decisions with people or jobs. So what's important about that is power needs to shift when you do a redesign to be consistent with whatever the business direction is. Power is sometimes most exercised not only through budgets and spending power, but also through decision-making and decisions. And so the importance of following the work and identifying decisions that go with the work is very key. Here's an example of a supply chain redesign that we did. That was a countrywide supply chain, largest in the UK. And this is their 7-8 step value stream with key decisions. And when you start to see work, you see how work is pretty simple in terms of it doesn't have to be overly complex or complicated. But it's one of the things that we do in this to avoid focusing on people and rather focusing and identifying work. This is our proprietary organization design methodology, which we connect business direction to work and decisions to then bounding that work and departmentalizing it, and then focusing on what we typically call glue mechanisms, both vertical and horizontal glue mechanisms, which essentially what are going to be the things that pull all the organization together, including the structural elements. And why this is important, as you'll see in here, is this pretty much lays out the work that we do early in the phases to get to a concept operating model and a detail operating model. But you can see there's no place in here do we talk about people, roles, or jobs. Any questions as to the pitfall, which is don't talk about people early on, stay out of that, and focus on the work? Excellent. Well, I'll move on. Pitfall number 3, leaders can get scared and can backtrack. Let me explain this one a little bit. This is particularly applicable to when you're using a collaborative design process. Ever need to make exceptions to the people rule? Good question, Michael. There are a few exceptions, so let me just share. I'm gonna answer that one in a few minutes, and I'll come back to it, and I'll give you a couple of examples. How about roles which regulators say are critical and must be considered early on in the design process? Yes. So Nick, excellent question. I'll address that here now. When we talk about the roles which regulators say are critical, we identify that on top of the value stream, and we'll start with just the work that needs to be done by those regulators without talking about the role or the job. So we will map that. So in some industries, all of you are well aware around compliance and regulatory nature of some of the work. And so that work has to be understood before you talk about roles and jobs. And so we do a secondary value stream that is basically just about oversight and regulatory and/or compliance. So I'm going to hold off on your question, Michael, and come back to it. So leaders get scared and backtrack. And the reason I want to highlight this is one project in particular is that I'll own this. It's early on in our career. We did a project where the leaders stepped out of the design process and wanted the teams to do the redesign, but actually said no, we can't do that. Obviously, a big learning for us, and we haven't had that happen since then. But this is particularly relevant if you're using whole-scale change or a large design process where you're involving a lot of people. So the key becomes for this is that you have to keep leaders involved all along the way. And so let me give you some practical examples of what we mean by leaders involved all along the way. We have a phase of work in our design process that we call the foundation phase. And in that phase of work, the leadership team, and it can be beyond the leadership team, but at minimum, it's the leadership team, come together with key stakeholders and identify the requirements, the parameters, and the constraints of a future operating model. And there are 14 to 16 decisions that have to be made, of which one of those is design criteria, but design criteria by itself is not enough. And in doing so, that phase ensures a complete alignment. In fact, we won't go into design work as a concept design or detail design if we sense in any way that there's splitting or there's misalignment or there's not head and heart commitment to the decisions that have been made. And that's a very important point I want to highlight. We call it the monopoly phase, which is, for those of you who played Monopoly before, you know, you do not pass go, do not collect your money. And it's no different for us in this phase, the foundation phase. One of the things we do here is a change impact analysis early on to make sure leaders are completely conscious and intentional and understand the consequences that they're asking of the organization, so that they're not in some kind of magical thinking, meaning that we can just change in a day and it won't be a big deal. So it's one way to kind of really drive intentional decision making. The other thing that happens as a result of our foundational work and not focusing on management roles and people is that most of our projects yield a 10 to 40% leadership turnover, pretty consistent across the board. And the reason for that is that for us, management roles are one of the last things that we put in place after the core work. And so because management is not core work and management activity is not considered core work, management roles, jobs, mechanisms are put over the top of the core work once that's well defined. In a design process, leaders wear multiple hats. And those multiple hats include being a subject matter expert, a leader of some part of the business, a contributor to the design process, and a potential sponsor. And those four roles, they have to be really clear about when they play those roles and when they don't play those roles. You're all aware that when a manager speaks in some culture, in some work environments and work cultures, people may interpret that as the final say. And so it's very important to make that very explicit that in fact should not be the case. And the other thing that this is a gift from Craig McGee in the early 90s about applying rolling decision making. One of the things that you're going to see in our design cycle here is there's diamonds in between each phase. So this is our design process, and you'll notice that there are diamonds in between each phase. Those are a period of review and approval for both key stakeholders and leaders. And so even with leaders in the room or being part of the design process, we still take time between each phase to actually do what we call phase gates and decision making, so that things are reviewed and they have time to understand it. How do you ensure, so Winnie's asking a question, how do you ensure continued buy-in by the leaders once they're aware of the possibility of losing their jobs, yet they need to deliver the design? Winnie, it's an excellent question, and it's a position we find ourselves in very often. So let me share with you what we do. Early on in the foundation phase, which we have highlighted here, is one of the 14 to 16 decisions has to be what we call an HR policy. And an HR policy is a practical statement by the organization that says if your job changes, if we don't have room for you, if there's not a job for you, if you choose to leave, if you get changed to a different team, if you have to work out of a different office, here's how you can expect to be treated. That HR policy is a proactive, very important proactive element that basically says, if you design yourself out of a job, we're going to have your back. You cannot do this work without having that HR policy in place, because the first place that it impacts is on the leadership. The other thing that we do is work very closely with the sole executive sponsor. There's always one or two people who are the ultimate decision makers and sponsors. And they will make a very clear statement to the leadership team in the room that basically says, we're not going to start with your jobs, but you're in this room and it's important for you to be here. So those things are explicitly addressed in the foundation phase early on. So between those two things, it creates the kind of environment that says, I need you, you're important, but I don't know what management job you're going to have, but you're in this room, and if you're wavering, just come talk to me. So that's how you ensure continued commitment. However, let me just say this, is you need to watch to whether that's actually, if they're actually walking the talk, or if they're just, or if it's just words. And then you have to intervene along the way. So it's not uncommon for us to talk with a leader, or for us to see a leader who's actually on the fence. Leaders will choose to leave for a number of reasons. One, which is they don't believe in the operating model. Their leadership style may not fit. And those conversations are going on all along the way, particularly in the foundation phase. I'm going to come back to Michael's question here before I move forward. So Michael is, ever need to make exceptions to the people rule? In this, as you're looking at this cycle, the exceptions that are fairly common for us is in the concept design phase. By the end of that phase, you can typically see where you're going to need level 2 leadership roles, meaning reporting to the executive sponsor. So think of it as the lieutenants of the organization, if you will. And at that point, some organizations actually then, coming out of the concept design phase, once it's approved, will then announce who's leading which parts of the organization. Sometimes, but also sometimes they will not announce, but they'll just have those individuals, those leaders, work and drive more of the work in the detailed design. But other than that, there's very, very rare exceptions to actually having to name individuals or go right to people. I will share with you, there are leaders who get quite antsy and say, we need to get people into roles and jobs, which is the last pitfall here. And we will do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. But I would say that's a pretty rare exception for us. I'm going to just look at the questions here. How do you manage when you have, so Nick, how do you manage when you have a very tight time frame in relation to limited availability of leaders to make these decisions together? Nick, this is a really good, so for us, one of the things we say is if you're not going to make those decisions and you don't have time, so the wisdom here is time is more valuable than money, particularly for leaders. And if they're not going to put the time in to do the foundation work correctly, then that's their way of showing the quid pro quo or their level of commitment. So we will have that discussion very bluntly with leaders because time is the one resource that they can choose where they want to spend it and how they want to spend it. Now, the other thing that can happen, Nick, is that there's some, but not much foundation work that we would ever recommend being done virtually, because the importance of the foundation phase is putting leaders in a pressure cooker where they have to basically debate, challenge, understand, and align with each other and be locked arm in arm. You don't get that from doing work virtually, and it's very difficult. But what we will do is we will accelerate the foundation phase into small chunks and or just accelerate it and compress it into a limited period of time to work with them. But what we won't do is they cannot delegate those decisions, and it can't be just half the team. So it becomes a conundrum for both us as a external vendor partner, as well as for the leadership team. All right, I'm going to keep us going. One of the things I wanted to highlight here is in our foundation phase, before I move on, is you get a very clear future business direction, a clear scope of work, a compelling business case for change, a comprehensive integrated change strategy forward, as well as the last one, number 5, which is the most important and is your monopoly, if you will, output, which is strong, robust, horizontal leadership alignment to move forward. If you don't have number 5 and you have all number 4, don't move forward, because things will get worse later on and downstream. So I'm going to keep moving then. All right. Pitfall number 4, poor implementation. Jacqueline, I think, Kate, you're on the call with us on the webinar. You did a really nice job with your article on implementation, governance, and structure and how important that is. I want to build on that and take it even farther. Poor implementation looks like many things, but one of the things that I want to emphasize is avoid at all costs just throwing people into org charts when you get to implementation. We've had, I can't tell you how many customers who have been in a hurry and get to concept design and say, okay, let's just put people in teams and move. And they end up 18 months later, people struggle and they're halfway between an old operating model and a new operating model. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that. The other wisdom here is think about injecting accelerated change readiness into the design process from start to finish, which is not the same as change management, which is a little bit more reactive and remedial. The other wisdom that I want to highlight here is in design work, you can throw people into jobs, but nothing changes until behaviors change, until the ways of working change. So the key for us is in implementation is ensuring the stabilization of the new operating model as well as behavior change. So let me take that a little bit further, and let me see if there are any questions before I go forward. No, we're going to keep rocking. All right here. So the first is that you should know in our design process is when we go into implementation, we target a 75% complete operating model and no more. And the reason being is it goes back to Chern's, for those of you who are aware of Albert Chern's guidelines for organization design. Talks a lot about white space. So basically to avoid over design. And what that basically means is because you're only 75% complete, it leaves white space for the organization to complete its own design process. So the responsibility when you get to implementation, the responsibility for completing and stabilizing the new operating model falls to the day-to-day teams and line leaders. And it's very critical that you do that. The opposite of that is typically over-design leads to traditionally what people talk about as reluctance or resistance. Well, if it's done right, you can minimize all of that reluctance and resistance. The second point here is implementation begins for us when we plan to fill jobs. So what's the plan for filling jobs? Lift and shift, interview, go external, as well as having comprehensive implementation plans, which includes structure, governance around implementation. Now that implementation plan has to include all your change readiness work. What's it going to take to get people ready to embrace and work in the new model in a positive way? The way we do that is the third bullet here is by ensuring change pull, or what we call readiness, is in 80% of affected units of the redesign before any implementation begins. So the whole idea of compliance versus commitment, or push versus pull, when you push a redesign onto an organization that's not ready to accept it, then you spend way more time in consequence management and compliance and trying to embed the design rather than moving quickly. And so for us, ensuring that readiness is in place in 80% of the organization, and yes, we do measure that, and is ready to go before we get to implementation is key for us. So change work has to be integrated with your design process. Focus on stabilizing the new operating model and ways of working. One of the things that I want to highlight here, and I see your question here, Michael, and I'll get to it in a second. I want to highlight that when you start with the work, typically in a redesign process, you start with the work. Work has to be identified as new work, changed work, or same work. And of course, that translates into when you start to put that work into roles and jobs and then assign people to it, then you have to understand what are the impacts for people to be able to do new and changed work. Now, the reason I'm sharing that with you is because it's basically, you can't throw people in jobs when they're either not ready or not skilled to do the work, if it's new or if it's changed. And so you're going to see what the implications for this means in just a second. And the last is in implementation during the transition planning phase, you have to set up your implementation structure, resources, governance, measures, and procedures to guide the implementation. So don't skip this. But let me go into detail here because I think it's way more than just the obvious things. So I'm going to move forward here for just a sec and then address your questions. So the first thing we do is we put into place an implementation dashboard. I'm going to come back to this dashboard and I want to talk about, I'm going to keep us going here for just a second. I'm going to talk about work transfer. So one of the things that is core for us in being able to actually, in a redesign process, it's pretty common for people to the work that they do to change So if it's not uncommon for 50% of the work people do today versus tomorrow has changed, and some of that may be completely new. And so for us, a more core fundamental element is what we call work transfer and tracking work transfer. Now that work transfer has to be set up on a pull process, not a push process. So work can't just be thrown over the fence and say, okay, someone in this team has to get it. So we set up an entire pull that is based on roles and jobs being filled by individuals. So for example, Nick Richmond on this call, if 50% of his work is going away, he can't throw it over the fence to Michael until Michael Gold is in the job and ready to receive it. And he receives a very direct communication from Michael that says, okay, I'm ready to receive the work. And so one of the things that I think is missed often in a redesign versus a restructure, it's simple to move people around in jobs and org charts. But when you do a redesign, if the work hasn't changed, I would suspect it's not really a redesign. And I know that sounds, fairly opinionated, but if you're not changing the work and what goes to the customers, then it's just restructure. I want to talk about governance and program coordination. We do, typically for us, when we begin implementation, we can have an issue log for issues that need to be resolved. That can be 300, 400, 500, 600, 700 issues deep. And those issues are solved by the line teams and those who are responsible for operating in the new model. And we track all of those issues. So we have a central repository, we have governance documents, stakeholder tracking, and as well as behavior tracking. A couple of big things to, Michael's asking the question, a couple of big things to ensure pull and how to measure. All right. Let me get to that, Michael. So this is the framework that we use for readiness. This comes from Ackerman, and Ackerman's change book put out, gosh, I think it was the late 90s, early 2000s. So basically, if you think about people moving through a change process, I'm not big on Kubler-Ross's stages of grief and loss, because I think what we see is if readiness is done well, you really have no hiccups in between implementing moving out of the old model into the new model. So you move people through a state of contact and awareness, which is something leaders can tell, but moving people into a state of acceptance to understand the change and positive perception requires them to get their hands dirty around the new operating model. And so we will work that acceptance to the point where people are saying, I get the new model, I get what we're trying to do, let's go. And when people are saying, let's go, I'm tired of design, I get what we're trying to do, that can be a behavioral signal that readiness is ready to rock and roll. So some of the big levers, Michael, that we use is we do, obviously, the biggest one is we involve people in their own change process. So for us, our preferred method for redesign is basically using large groups to redesign themselves and redesign their own organizations. Where the other thing that we'll do is we'll run change liaison workshops for the organization through what we call a roll the marble activity, which is in a roll the marble activity is basically identifying how work happens today and let people play that out. It's similar to a simulation. And then we put in the new operating model and we show them the concept and we let them get their hands dirty about how the new operating model would work. And it's through doing things of that nature and allowing people to get their hands dirty that really creates, from a neuroscience perspective, much more acceptance, and it moves away, takes away the pain and the ambiguity that sometimes can make people freeze. I'm going to see if there are any other questions here before I move forward. Michael, let me know if I answered that question for you. I'm going to go backwards here just for a second. I wanted to show you some of the metrics that we use in our scorecards for implementation because it becomes very important. And this work transfers to our customers. So we work with the customer and the structure and implementation governance teams to basically manage these metrics, including things like work that moves into a new boundary, into a new team, and the percentage and where we're at. So we will take this measurement weekly, sometimes bi-weekly. Back to this implementation dashboard. For those of you who are not Brits on the call, a baton is the same as work transfer. We also look at percentages of key mechanisms that are put in place and have gone live. So these are glue mechanisms, anything from meetings to sign-offs to governance mechanisms. So we will track that. And you can see that on the left here, we have open versus complete tasks. And so all of these things are tracked during implementation. What is the behavior tracking? So one of the things that we will do is we will use Teams self-report, Michael, in terms of, so once we get past the scorecard, we'll also do self-report. I mean, it's quite common when we're involved in implementation to put in recognition programs to spotlights on individuals who are working in the new model. So we use that anecdotal evidence as well as potential spot surveys, brown bag lunches, where people connect with other people in the organization to talk about what's the status of the operating model and how well they're doing. The other thing that we've tracked before, we don't always track it, is workarounds. Are people stopping things that they did in the past and are working within the new systems, mechanisms, teams, and so we'll sometimes track those as well. We're about 8:45 on our clock, so we got about 15 minutes. Want to highlight just one more as we move through examples of things we do to avoid the pitfall of throwing people into jobs and then having them struggle. So this is the push versus pull. This is the procedure that we use to put that into place. This is how we track work transfer, and I've gone through the change model that we actually apply. Lastly, I want to talk about push versus pull, and very simple model. And this is actually comes from the literature and comes from what we find. So evidence here. When you push an organization design onto an organization without commitment and the readiness in place for people to take on the new operating model, you're basically what we call pay now versus pay later. You're basically moving fast up front, but you're going to pay the price, and you're going to pay a more of a price, both in terms of time and effort and other resources, in terms of stabilizing that new operating model. In fact, some operating models never get fully stabilized because there's just the effort and attention isn't paid to implementation. When you take the time to involve people in their own design process and you involve them as much as you can, what we find in the pull and aiming for commitment and readiness is that things go slower fast, but it's faster implementation. And the reason it's faster implementation is because you've worked out all the bugs. People's head and heart are completely committed to the new operating model. Now, this has a big cost in it. And the cost has to do with effort. So you'll have an increased work burden, so effort, resources, to stabilize a new operating model when you use a push effort over a pull effort. And which requires, the pull effort requires heavily socialization, lots of beta testing, getting your hands dirty, trying things on, people making it their own, and not in just terms of lip service, and giving them, from a neuroscience perspective, giving people a chance to build new muscle memory. This is not, if you look at all the neuroscience around behavior change and around change, it talks about patterns and how do you replace old patterns with new patterns. And one of the things that we do quite substantially early on is in that beta testing is giving people the opportunity to build those new muscle memories and having them work that through, which is why we talk about implementation is not the same as stabilization. So in design work, there is no such thing as flip the switch and you're on. So before I go forward and see if there's any more questions, Johan, could you please point me to a down-to-earth definition of governance and what defines a good governance? Got it. I'll tell you how we talk about governance has to do with issues of compliance and oversight. So a practical example would be HR having to sign off from a business leader who wants to hire a new position. That's a form of internal governance that's based on policy, but you can also have compliance based on governance that's related to compliance that has to do with regulatory and laws and regulations. If anyone has a good resource that could help Johan, you can go ahead and type it in here. I personally don't have a good book definition of governance. Chuck, I think you're on this call. Chuck, can you point him in a direction? All right, so with that, before I close up and bring things to close, are there any other questions that you might have? Oh, you're talking about corporate governance. I got it, Johan. I don't have a good resource for corporate governance. But if anyone does, please add it in here into the chat box. So I want to highlight a couple of things as we go forward. Before I say thank you, I want to highlight the ODC, and I want to highlight if there are several of you on this call. I think Peter Turgus is on the call. Amy, I'm not sure. Amy Cates, I'm not sure you're on the call. Those individuals I just mentioned are certified organization design professionals. And I can't say enough about the importance in our industry to have some shared standards. And so the ODC, working with the ODF and the EODF, have come up with a certification process of which I'm honored to be part of that group. But if any of you are thinking on this call about wanting to get deeper into org design, you should seriously consider reaching out to the ODC in regards to getting certified. The other thing is, for those of you who follow the ODC, August 9th is our annual one-day meeting or conference. And this year it's going to be hosted by Fanish, and it's going to be on teams and organization design. And in the next week, the detail of the meeting is going to be released. And rumor has it that it's a pretty substantive and going to be a pretty substantive agenda with lots of good topics. I know several of you have attended that in the past. So the ODC is here as a huge resource for us. For those of you who want to continue from on the Mark side, is next week we have Peter Turgus and I will be doing rolling out the employee lifecycle operating model for HR webinar. We do Ask Me Anything org design related webinar, which is basically open-ended. And then later on this month, January 30th, working with the Organization Design Forum, I'll be doing a webinar on Beyond Strategic Organization Design and working at the operating model level. So with that, are there any other comments or questions before I bid you farewell? All right, looking at that. I don't see anything from your experience. How effective are rewards when trying to change behavior? Let me address this real quick on the rewards. We try not to do carrot and stick rewards for changing behavior. What we try to do is recognition and peer-to-peer recognition. And so that it's more genuine rather than people just kind of throwing things out. And so that's a really big, one of our tactics during implementation is really peer-to-peer recognition, putting the spotlight on where people are working in the new model and what it means, and so that it's peer-to-peer rather than top-down. All right, with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone, and you're welcome. You're welcome, Winnie. You're welcome, Audrey, Susanna, and everyone on the call. We're officially ending, and thanks for your time.